So today we're talking about what secular Jews, what humanistic Jews do believe, and it's important to remember that we are not non-believers. We have plenty of positive beliefs, and just as we described identifying political movements in positive terms, as the pro-life and pro-choice movements have tried to do, we can define ourselves positively as well. However, one of the challenges I found in trying to articulate what the positive beliefs of a humanistic Judaism could be is that I run into resistance from people who don't like to be told what to think. In general, people who are attracted to our approach to life don't like to be told what to think. They sometimes don't even like to be told what they already think, because they want to speak for themselves. So I find myself on the horns of this dilemma when I'm trying to articulate what secular Jews believe. Am I being descriptive and simply describing, as if I've done surveys, what people tend to think? Or am I being prescriptive and telling them this is what you should think? The reality is it's a little bit of both. I have my opinions, certainly, and I don't mind sharing them. That's one of the reasons I got into the job that I did. At the same time, I would like to represent the spectrum of perspectives that are included under the umbrella of humanistic Judaism. So there may be words, vocabulary, framing that I wouldn't use to describe myself, but that we use as a movement to describe the range of perspectives that are part of what we do and part of members who are part of our communities. So just keep this in mind as we go through these statements of belief. I'll give you a couple examples of sort of core principles, a platform of who we are and what we do. But if you don't feel represented by that in every detail, that's part of the descriptive-prescriptive dynamic that we're trying to balance. One of the resistances that we get in trying to sell our message or find people who are interested in what we do is that Jews, at least today, often don't care that much about what they believe. They're not animated by firm, fervent belief. Now, some Jews are, for sure, either on the far secular end or the far religious end. But most Jews in the middle don't always think that much about what do I actually believe. About 15 years ago, there was an article in the Chicago Tribune that appeared profiling me and our congregation. And some of our friends who were members of a Reform synagogue used that as an opportunity to talk about the God question, because they had never talked about it. It had just never come up in their conversations. They're a married couple. They'd been married for 5 years at that point. But they had just never talked about what they believed about those questions, because it was irrelevant. It didn't matter for what they would join or for how they celebrated Passover. They just did what was traditional, and they didn't think about what they believed. Sometimes you'll even find people who will try to make that a positive value of Judaism and say Judaism doesn't care what you believe. It's only about what you do. As we saw with the list of commandments and mitzvot, some of those commandments are about what you should believe, and we'll see some other examples of texts that show you that historically, at least, Jews did care what you believed. But today, people don't want to talk about beliefs, maybe because they don't believe what they think they're supposed to believe, or at least not all of it. One of the innovations of humanistic Judaism was giving people the freedom to say what they actually believed, to find out what they believe by looking at how they live their lives, and by giving them an opportunity to live a Jewish life consistent with what they actually believed. Again, that's why it's a hard sell, because many people don't even think about those questions of belief. As one of the readings in our Shabbat service pointed out, Jewish beliefs have been different and have changed over time. I sometimes describe the evolution of Judaism as a transition from cult to culture. As we started, we were an animal sacrifice cult, and as many details in the Hebrew Bible and in archaeology suggest to us, early on our ancestors were in fact polytheistic. The narrative of the Bible says that originally we were monotheists, and then we degraded, we backslid into polytheism and worshiping many gods. But originally, the pure version from Abraham and Moses and King David was purely monotheistic. The problem is the archaeology doesn't lend itself to that conclusion. There's plenty of examples, both found in the ground and, if you look carefully at the Bible, that suggests there was a polytheistic phase of Jewish religion. For example, in the story of Noah, one of the corruptions of the earth that causes God to wipe it out with a flood is the sons of God come down and have children with the daughters of men. Who are the sons of God? And what are they doing hooking up with the daughters of men? Sounds very polytheistic, doesn't it? Sounds very Greek, mythological, right? That's in Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 6. It's right there. We've already used the example from the Ten Commandments of you will have no other gods before me, implying that there are other gods, and why would you be jealous of things that don't exist? You even have a passage where the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, shows up to a prophet and he says, I am God. Normally you would think a God wouldn't have to identify themselves by their role. It would be sort of self-evident. But most likely this is a phase of consolidating a concept of many gods with many names into one. So if the Hebrew God is named Yud-He-Vav-He, Yahweh, maybe there was another god named El that was a sky god, and we see evidence of that in Canaanite literature. So at some point, they had to say, you say Yahweh, I say El, it's the same God. Sort of like the Greek and Roman pantheons, or how Greek polytheism conquered the world, and said, well, your hearth god is actually called this. And they found ways to syncretize the various religions. In fact, Jewish intellectual evolution on the God question probably went, rather than monotheism back to polytheism and back to monotheism, it evolved more like this. It began as polytheistic with many gods, a storm god and a sky god, a fertility goddess, and all of those concepts. And then it became something called henotheism. Henotheism means there's one God more important than all the other gods. In fact, you can hear an echo of this in the famous Song at the Sea, where Miriam sings, Mi kamocha ba'elim. Who is like you among the gods? El is the word for God. Mi kamocha ba'elim. Who is like you among the gods? Now, if you've only read the English translation, sometimes they translate it as, who is like you among the mighty? Because they don't want to say gods, even though the literal Elim means gods. But that's saying God is, the Hebrew God is more important than all the other gods. That's a henotheistic approach. There's also a concept called monolatry, which means you're only allowed to worship one God. It's not monotheism, there's only one God, but it's monolatry. You can only worship, you can only talk to the one jealous God. Now that begins to make sense. And it's only after the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of Jews into Babylon around the year 586 BCE that it shifts to what we would think of as a pure monotheism. And it happens as a brilliant maneuver to respond to tragedy. Historically, when you had two peoples in military conflict with each other, it was also thought to be a battle of the gods. Our God was fighting your God. And if you lose, our God beat your God. And often you would start worshiping the winner God because they won. And who would want to worship a loser God? The brilliant maneuver that the priests and prophets made in Jewish thought was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was a major defeat. The kingdom was conquered, the city was burned, the main shrine of the god was destroyed. How do you save face for a God whose house has been destroyed? What you do is you say, in fact, he wanted it to happen. It's not that the Babylonian God defeated the Hebrew God. The Hebrew God is in charge of everything, and he brought the Babylonians to punish the Jews. The Jews had a covenant. They made a deal with their God, and they broke it. They whored after other gods, they followed impure practices, they didn't do justice, and so they would be punished. It's not a sign of Yahweh's weakness that they lost, it's a sign of his power. He caused them to lose, he wanted them to lose, and if they turn back to the right path, he might allow them to return and to rebuild. Now, from a psychological perspective, it's not very healthy. It's blaming the victim. It's saying, you suffered and it's your fault. But from a theological perspective, it preserves the reputation of your God, and by extension, the priests of that God, who want to be in charge, and enables them to continue to believe. But it also marks a theological shift to a universal God, a monotheistic system. But it still retains elements of that parochial model. You know, philosophers got to a monotheistic conclusion too. But their version of monotheism was the universal creator God of every people, and it wasn't particular. It didn't insist on Hebrew. It didn't have a chosen people, or a chosen place, or a chosen building. But because Hebrew monotheism evolved out of this parochial national God model, what you wind up is with a paradox of a universal God of all the world that created the universe and chose one people with a very hard to learn language to reveal all the truths for the universe, and that's it. And he has one place that's his favorite place in all the world, and he has one building that's his favorite building in all the world, and he has one room that's his favorite room in all the buildings in all the world. It's called the Holy of Holies. He has one family of this favorite people, the Cohens, the priests, and the high priest, the Cohen Tzedek. If you know someone named Katz, they may descend from that family. The high priest was the favorite clan of that favorite large family. He had a favorite calendar. That was the Jewish calendar. He had a favorite day on the favorite calendar, which was the Day of Atonement. He had a favorite language of all the languages in all the world. And he had a favorite word in all those languages, and that was his name, which you weren't allowed to say. So this is that paradox of a universal monotheistic concept married to an ethnocentric tribal God system. But that's a great example of an evolution of Jewish thought, where Jewish beliefs changed over time. We have evidence in both the archaeology and in the Bible itself. So who's to say that Judaism and belief are irrelevant to each other? In fact, they are very relevant to each other. I already mentioned earlier in the weekend the transition from, with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, from an animal sacrifice system to the rabbinic version of Judaism. Because now if you could not sacrifice animals in the temple anymore, how are you going to atone for sins? How are you going to relate to the God if the only way is through the sacrifices? And that's how the rabbis came up with the idea of an oral Torah, which justified using words instead of animal sacrifices. They scheduled 3 daily services to match the 3 daily sacrifices that have been offered. They do a musaf, an additional prayer recitation on Shabbat, just as there was a musaf, an additional prayer, animal sacrifice on Shabbat at the temple. In fact, the prescribed Torah readings for most of the holidays are the lists of the sacrifices that would have been offered. It's almost as if the rabbis were telling God, we want you to know that we know what we're supposed to do. We can't do it because the temple isn't there, but we're going to read the passage that tells us what to do so that you know that we know that this is what we're supposed to do. That was a major shift, to believe that a God would accept words instead of animals. There's even the debate, and you hear it around even today, of whether Jews believed in an afterlife. Now you'll hear today, many people say Jews don't believe in an afterlife, but they've never read an Orthodox prayer book if they think that. Because there's plenty of passages in that prayer book that refer to a Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, literally the re-enlivening, like Chaim, Techiyat HaMetim, and something they call Ha'olam Haba, the world to come. They refer to the coming of a Messiah, the reestablishment of the kingdom. There's a reason why old Jews would go to Israel to get buried on the Mount of Olives, because that's where the resurrection would start, and they wanted to be first in line. What else is new? Now, one question you might ask is, if the resurrection happens on the Mount of Olives, what happens to everybody buried in Eastern Europe or buried in Morocco? And the thought was that there were underground tunnels, and they sort of roll their way all the way to pop up. And there were debates over whether do they pop up naked, do they have clothes on, what have you. There's plenty of literature in the traditional Jewish sources that talk about a Jewish concept of an afterlife. So where did this idea come from that Jews don't believe in an afterlife? Well, it actually comes mostly from the 19th century, when it became sort of gauche to imagine, or backwards, primitive. Really, you're debating whether people are dressed or not when they come out of the ground and they come back to life. Rather, they thought it would be much more dignified and respectable from an Enlightenment perspective to believe in a kind of immortal soul. So maybe there's an immortal soul, or maybe even we don't need an immortal soul, we just focus on this life, and when you die you become part of the all, in some nebulous sense. You can read in the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform of American Reform Judaism, the last clause that says explicitly, we believe in the eternity of the soul, but we reject as concepts not rooted in Judaism the idea of Gehenna and Eden. Gehenna is the Hebrew word for hell, or a burning place, from Gehinnom, which is a valley outside of Jerusalem, and Eden, like Eden, the Garden of Eden in paradise. What I find hilarious about that item is they use the Hebrew words for the concepts that they say are not rooted in Judaism. But that was that 19th century Enlightenment style of saying this was an addition from the outside and we reject it. It's not really part of the true Judaism. But guess what? Large numbers of Jews did and do believe in some kind of afterlife. But large numbers don't. So this is again where what do Jews believe is more of a sociological question than a prescriptive question. It's asking what they believe and not what you should believe. All the prescriptive versions of Jewish theology tell you what you should believe, but sometimes it's more interesting to ask what people do believe. And there was even an evolution of what the boundaries of being Jewish should be. Should being Jewish be defined by nationality and national boundaries? After all, that's where it started. To be Jewish was to be a Judahite, to live in Judah, or Jewland. You were defined by national boundaries. You spoke the national language. At one point, the Bible calls it Yehudit. They spoke Jewish, and not Yiddish. They spoke Hebrew. But after this exile to Babylon, and this concept of a universal God develops, the question is raised, how can we sing Yahweh's song in a foreign land? It's a quote from the Psalms. How do we sing your song in a foreign land? But they can. In fact, when they had the opportunity to return from Babylon, after the exile was over and a new kingdom had conquered the Babylonians, some of them stayed. They said, we don't have to go back. It's the beginning of what today we call a diaspora. Diaspora was not the historic term for it. They used to call it galut. Galut meant exile. That means you're not where you belong. It means you're away from home. But diaspora has a much more positive sense to it. Dia, like a diagram, is sort of spreading out, and spore, like seeds. You spread the seeds out, and they plant, and they grow differently in different soil and different sun. It's a very natural metaphor, and there's nothing wrong with being part of a diaspora. It's a natural process, and can be very germinative and be very creative. So we like the term diaspora more now. The issue was, how do you do Jewish in the diaspora if you're not in the temple itself? And where do you draw the boundaries? If you're no longer a national identity with borders and language like a country, but you're living in Babylon and you might be speaking Babylonian or Aramaic or some other language, maybe you move to Alexandria in the last couple centuries BCE and you start speaking Greek. You don't go to the temple every 3 times a year for your animal sacrifices. You have to come up with something else. And that's why the synagogue actually starts before the temple was destroyed. We think of it as a response to the temple being destroyed, but actually the earliest synagogues were created before, because you couldn't get to Jerusalem every time. You needed a place to meet locally, and so a Beit Knesset, or a house of meeting, which is the Hebrew term for synagogue, develops even before. And you're experiencing other peoples. You're not in a national territory bounded by your own ethnic group. You're meeting other people, and sometimes you like those other people. Occasionally you marry those other people. And how do you define who's in and who's out? And there were actually 2 trends on this at this time period, after that return from Babylon. One is exemplified by the Book of Ezra. If you read the Book of Ezra, it describes, it's actually a combined book in the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah. If you read those 2 books together, you'll see a description of the people coming back from exile and facing this mixed population of Jews who have married with the surrounding peoples, and rejects it. It tells the people, send away your foreign wives, get rid of them, expel them, or else you're out. And some of them do. They send away their foreign wives and children, and they cut them out of the Jewish story. Others refuse to do so, and they are cut out of the Jewish story. But another trend that appears almost at the same time is exemplified by the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth describes a young Moabite woman named Ruth who marries a Hebrew, and the Moabiteness is important. Do you remember where the Moabites came from according to the Bible? The daughters of Lot. Remember, they sleep with him. One of them creates a son named Moab, so they've been bastards and sons of incest and terrible people. Later commandments say do not welcome them into the congregation for 3 and 4 generations, so it's like they have to knock on the door for 3 generations and then finally you let them in. She's a Moabite. But her ethics are exemplary, even after her husband has died. She follows her mother-in-law Naomi back to Bethlehem, supports her, and in her famous speech says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Where you die, let me be buried. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Not only does she exemplify positive values and follow the arcane and crazy rules of who has the right to marry her before Boaz, who is also one of her kinsmen, and they have to go through this whole ritual called chalitza. It's fascinating but off topic. At the end of the story, she marries Boaz, she has a child, and that child has a child named David. So Ruth is in fact the grandmother of King David, not just a Moabite, and not just a Moabite representing good values, but the ancestor of King David, which is the line of the Messiah. Remember that song we sing at Passover, Eliyahu Hanavi? Right? What's the middle part of the song? Bimheira b'yamenu, soon in our days, Yavo aleinu, come to us, Im Moshiach ben David, with the Messiah, son of David. Moshiach means anointed with oil, which was the ritual to declare someone a king. And so the Mashiach, the Messiah, would be the king restoring the line of King David. And Ruth is given credit for being the ancestor of the Messiah. That's a very different school of thought from Ezra, which wanted to send them away. But they're both part of this background of Jewish belief and definition and who makes the boundaries. So we've changed quite a bit over the centuries in what we believe. We've even had examples of skeptical and secular Jewish thought, even in pre-modern times. We didn't just start with the Reform movement and the Enlightenment in the 19th century. You may be familiar with Baruch Spinoza, who lived in the 17th century, mid-1600s, but there are other examples as well, and I want to take you through one of those, which dates back to the Hellenistic period. So we're talking about the last couple centuries BCE and the first couple centuries of the Common Era. In that time period, the rabbis had 2 major antagonists, people they didn't like, who they accepted were Jewish, but they didn't like them. One was a group they called the Am Haaretz. Am Haaretz literally means people of the land, or peasants. They were people who didn't follow rabbinic law because they didn't know any better. They were just dumb or ignorant or uneducated. They're just an Am Haaretz. The other group that they didn't like, they called Apikoros. Apikoros meant heretic, but it meant someone who knew better, who didn't follow Jewish law because they read too much Greek philosophy, they were too assimilated, they were too distant from the rabbis, they were too chutzpahdik, they wouldn't listen to authority. Well, sounds familiar, right? Now, you may have recognized in that title, Apikoros, the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And if you read Epicurus, it's a breath of fresh air. Epicurus said, yeah, there may be gods out there, but why would they care what we do? Why would a god's happiness be contingent on human beings talking to them or not talking to them? So don't worry about the gods. Do what you need to do in this life. And he didn't believe in an afterlife. He said when you die, your body gets dispersed into atoms. They get spread out all over the world. And just as you didn't know what was going on before you were born, you won't know what's going on after you die. So don't be afraid. Don't worry about what happens after you die. Live a good life here and now. Have good friends. Be virtuous. Sounds pretty good to me. In fact, he was very frustrating to his antagonists because they figured if he didn't believe in the gods and didn't follow conventional pieties, he'd be a terrible person. But he was a very virtuous person and enjoyed friendship and lived a very simple life. Unfortunately, in modern English, the word epicure, if someone's described as an epicure, there's someone who's sort of like a glutton, who's only interested in sensual pleasures and fine food and so on, which is sort of the opposite of what Epicurus actually was, sort of the epithet used against him. But Epicurus represented a relatively secular approach to life. I find it fascinating that his name became the Hebrew term for heretic. Singular apikoros, plural apikorsim. Evidently, there were either enough rabbis who had read Epicurus to know what he was saying, or enough lay Jews who read Epicurus to agree with him. And we have plenty of examples of Jews reading Greek literature, even translating the Bible into Greek before the year 0. So the basis of what we now call the Old Testament, or the Christian first part of the Bible, was actually translated from Hebrew into Greek by Jews before Jesus even lived. Because the Hebrew schools weren't so good in Alexandria, and they wanted to understand it, so they put it into Greek. And of course, if you translate it into Greek, you can read other Greek words as well. Philosophy, history, plays, dramas, literature, and so on. So I wanted to give you some stories of a particularly famous apikoros, or heretic, whose name we know and we don't know. In the mainstream rabbinic sources, they didn't want to preserve his name. So they simply called him Acher, the other. But in other sources, we found that same rabbi, and he was in fact a rabbi, was referred to as Alicia ben Avaya. So we call him Rabbi Alicia. But he had experiences in his life that turned him away from the straight and narrow path of rabbinic Judaism. And I'll give you a couple of those stories here. By the way, if you find the character of Rabbi Alicia interesting, there's a wonderful novel by Meir Steinberg called As a Driven Leaf, which dramatizes the story of Rabbi Alicia. And it's a wonderful job of collecting rabbinic sources and archaeology and other pieces together. It's historical fiction, so don't take it as gospel, but accept it as a creative retelling of Rabbi Alicia's life. I just reread it a couple years ago, having read it in my 20s, and it's still very, very good. Might make a nice book club discussion too. So here are some stories from the original sources about Rabbi Alicia. You see it on the screen there. I'll make it a little bigger for you. Okay. So Alicia was raised in a traditional rabbinic setting. He trained with traditional rabbis, but he was open to learning from the wider world. It is said of him, of Acher, that when he entered a meeting place for scholars and saw youngsters with scrolls in front of them, he would say, "Why do these sit here and occupy themselves thus? This one's craft should be that of a builder. This one's that of a carpenter. That one's of a painter. And that one a tailor." When the youngsters heard such talk, they left their scrolls and went away. What was he saying to them? Get a job. And not just get a job that makes something, that does something. Build, carpenter, painting, tailor, do something that contributes to humanity. Don't just sit there and study. I know plenty of people that could use this lesson, both in graduate school and in yeshiva. It is also said of him, of Acher, that Greek song did not cease from his mouth, and whenever he rose to leave the house of study, many heretical books would fall out of his lap. It's almost like he would be sitting in the study hall like this. On the outside, you would see the prayer book, the study book, the scroll, but on the inside, he had his secret book to read. I actually did a funeral for someone some years ago who was not interested in Jewish religion at all, but his wife was more interested. So they joined a Reform temple. And after a couple of years, he realized that the old Union prayer books, which were these little green books, were the same size and shape as the Loeb Classical Library, which has a collection of philosophy, Greek history, and so on. And so what he would do is bring a volume of the Loeb Classical Library to services. And that's what he would read. And everyone thought he was being so focused and pious on the service because he was so attentive to what was happening in the book. But that was his cover. It was like Alicia, who would have heretical Greek books hiding in his lap, even in the house of study. So again, from this lesson you see, if they're calling him Acher, if he's the heretic who's left, beware of the outside books. Don't read beyond the orbit of what you're allowed to read. This is again that limitation of our concept of Judaism as open to study and knowledge from everywhere and ask questions. Well, some questions, some books are a bridge too far. There's a couple of texts that also explore why did he become a heretic. Some say Alicia became a heretic when he saw a pig dragging along in its mouth Rabbi Chutzpit, the interpreter's tongue. He said the tongue from which pearls of purest ray used to come forth is to lick the dust, and he resolved to commit sin. In other words, here was someone who was pious, who was a rabbi and who was killed. This is during the Roman persecution around the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so he saw, of all things, a pig dragging his tongue in the dirt. And he said, there must not be any justice. A famous phrase attributed to Alicia, but probably not historical, was he would see a scene like this and he would say, Ein dayan ve'ein din. There is no judge and there is no justice. Sort of like Job's challenge, but going one step further. And then the other famous story is this one. What did Heirs see that made him go wrong? It is said that once, while sitting and studying in the valley of Gennesar, he saw a man climb to the top of a palm tree on the Sabbath, take the mother bird with the young, and descend in safety, which is violating what it says in the Torah. The Torah says, first of all, you don't do this on Shabbat. But secondly, if you go to take eggs from a nest, shoo away the mother bird, take the eggs, and then... So he's breaking the law on Shabbat. At the end of the Sabbath, he saw another man climb to the top of the same palm tree, and a snake bit him and he died. So one waited for the end of Shabbat and died. The one that broke the law got away with it. Alicia exclaimed, it is written, let the mother go and take only the young, that you may fare well and have a long life. Where is the well-being of this man? Where is the prolonging of his life? Some say it's when he saw the tongue of Rabbi Judah the baker. Again, a similar story to what we saw about Rabbi Chutzpit. And he said, since that is so, there is no reward for the righteous and no resurrection of the dead. He saw life, experienced cosmic injustice, and he said, it's all wrong. As they say in one passage, he cut off the shoes. He said, forget it. It's wrong. Well, you can see why he was written out of histories. Right? Can't include that. Except they did include it. They just wrote his name out. It's interesting that our mainstream tradition, even the Talmud that traditional Orthodox Jews study all the time, has some of these stories about Rabbi Alicia the heretic. That the Apikoros is both outside and still included in the tradition. We see it appear again in a passage that describes who has a share in the world to come. This is in the Mishnah, an early collection of rabbinic laws, chapter 10 in the Sanhedrin, that section. All Israel has a portion in the world to come. And these are they that have no share in the world to come. So all Israel except for those people. He that says there is no resurrection of the dead laid down in the Torah. That makes sense. Why should you be entitled to it if you don't accept that it's there? He that says the Torah is not from heaven, and a heretic or an apikoros. These are the three categories of Israelites that have no share in the world to come. If you don't accept that the resurrection of the dead appears in the Torah, which by the way it doesn't, if you say that the Torah is not from heaven, which it isn't, and if you're an apikoros, a heretic who knows the law but decides not to follow it, or rejects the basic beliefs, which many of us do. So I'm over 3 on that scale. There's even a fascinating passage here. This is later in Sanhedrin, in the Talmudic commentary on what is an apikoros and what do you do with them. Rabbi Eliezer said, be diligent to learn the Torah and know how to answer an apikoros. If you run into one of these Greek-inflected philosophy people who are going to challenge you, know your stuff and know how to answer them. Rabbi Yochanan commented, they taught this only with respect to a Gentile apikoros. With a Jewish apikoros, it would only make his heresy more pronounced. He's just going to argue back and become more convinced. So don't even bother with the Jewish apikoros. In later rabbinic thought, the apikoros is said to not count for a minyan. The apikoros cannot be a sofer, a scribe. Anything that he writes should be discarded and not accepted as a valid mezuzah or a Torah scroll. Even if it's fully kosher by practice, their beliefs trafe up the object. So again, anyone who says it's only about practice, it's not about belief, doesn't know the sources. I've often thought that our communities could make a cappella singing groups and call them the apikoros. It turns out that the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Seminary had a singing group they called the apikoros, so they had the idea first. I'll give them the credit. So in this history of Jewish thought and life, we've had attempts to try to tell you what to think, to tell you what to believe. There are some attempts made to codify blessings, and the Siddur, the prayer book, is one. And Maimonides, in the 1200s, came up with what he called the principles of faith. And it's recited as part of the daily Orthodox prayer service. If you look at an Art Scroll Siddur, a mainstream Orthodox Siddur, you'll find it there as well. So I want to give you these 13 principles of faith, each of which begins with Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema. I believe with perfect faith. I believe with perfect faith the Creator, blessed is His name, creates and guides all creatures, and He alone made, makes, and will make everything. I believe with perfect faith the Creator is unique. There is no uniqueness like His in any way, and He alone is our God who was, is, and always will be. I believe the Creator is not physical and is not affected by physical phenomena, and there is no comparison whatsoever to Him. You can hear some of the interreligious dialogue of the Middle Ages going on here, right? Number 3 is an example of rejecting Christianity, which believed that God had become flesh and then gone back to God. That's out from our perspective. Number 4, I believe with complete faith the Creator is the very first and the very last. Does that ring any bells for anybody? Who else is described as being the first and the last? Sorry? Yeah, Jesus is described as the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last letter of the Greek alphabet. So this is a claim for that as well. Or a response to that, rather. Number 5, I believe with complete faith the Creator, to Him alone it is proper to pray, and not proper to pray to any others. So no Father, Son, Holy Spirit, no saints, right? Only directly to God. I believe with complete faith that all the words of the prophets are true. I believe with complete faith that the prophecy of Moses, Rabbeinu, our Rabbi, was true, and he was the Av HaNevi'im, the father of the prophets, both those who preceded him and those who followed him. Who's that a response to? Who's described as the seal of the prophets? Muhammad. Remember, from a Muslim perspective, Judaism had a revelation. It was just monotheism 1.0. And Christianity had a revelation that was monotheism 2.0. But Islam and Muhammad's revelation is monotheism 3.0. And why would you bother with 1.0? Who wants Windows 95 now? Forget it. And Muhammad himself is described as the seal of the prophets. The best one is the last. The claim that Maimonides makes here is that Moses was the father of the prophets and the best one was the first, not the one at the end.
Does seal of the prophets suggest that we've sealed it and it's done?
Yep. Yeah, that's the last one, right. This is the final fulfilling prophecy, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that the Baha'i faith is deeply persecuted in Islamic territories, because the Baha'u'llah was claiming a kind of prophecy and a new kind of revelation, which was an explicit violation of Islam's principles. Number 8, I believe with complete faith that the entire Torah in our hands now is the same one that was given to Moses, our teacher. This is the Torah that Moses placed before, exactly as it was. I believe with complete faith that this Torah will not be exchanged, nor will there be another from the Creator, blessed be His name. No New Testament, no Quran, this is it. Number 10, I believe with complete faith the Creator knows all the deeds of human beings and their thoughts. Remember our discussion about coveting? He knows. He knows what you're thinking. I believe with complete faith He rewards with good those who observe His commandments and punishes those who violate His commandments. The world is just and fair. You may not believe it, but it is. Number 12, I believe with complete faith in the coming of the Messiah. Even though He may delay, nevertheless I anticipate every day that He will come. You may have heard this sung in some congregations. Ani ma'amin b'viat HaMashiach. And even though He tarries, still I believe. And number 13, I believe with complete faith there will be a resuscitation of the dead whenever the wish emanates from the Creator, blessed be His name and exalted is mentioned forever and all eternity. Again, an affirmation of an afterlife, explicitly. So these were Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. Now there were some rabbis who disagreed with this concept, who didn't want to have a doctrine, a catechism like this, But this became part of the mainstream rabbinic practice, to have this affirmation of, I believe with perfect faith. Now, I mentioned that I'm 0 for 3 on the test in Sanhedrin, about believing in resurrection of the dead in the Torah, and the Torah's from heaven. I'm also 0 for 13 on this list. And my guess is that most humanistic Jews are 0 for 13, maybe 1 for 13. Most Reformed Jews are probably not 13 for 13, we'll put it that way. So, this is an attempt to try to tell people what to think. And Spinoza's response to this, I think, is really insightful. Spinoza's writing in the 1650s and 60s. You may recall he was expelled from his Jewish community in Amsterdam for his heretical thoughts. You can read his excommunication written. It's very serious. They condemn him with every possible curse, and no one is to talk to him, no one is to have anything to do with him or anything that he does. One of his heretical thoughts was on the nature of thought and belief itself. Spinoza points out in his Theological Political Tractatus, an excerpt of which is in our Judaism in a Secular Age, he's like the precursor to who we are. It says that nobody can make you think anything. They can make you say things, they can make you write things, but they can't make you believe or think anything. If they can't convince you, if your reasoning mind doesn't come to that conclusion, no one can make you think that 2 + 2 is 5. They can make you say it through threats, through punishment, through taxation, through oppression, but they can't make you think it. On some level, there is a free thought. And Spinoza's conclusion from that is, since that's the case, any government or any system of religion that imposes belief on people is doomed to failure and unethical. Telling people what to believe and what to think is just wrong. Because if you convince them, fine. Have argument, fine. But imposing it, demanding it, not fine. Well, today we live on the other side of the Enlightenment. We have changed our perspectives quite a bit. We don't believe the 13 principles of Maimonides and his version of Jewish belief. Why don't we believe it? Well, I included in the packet, and I'll show you here, an example of it was a viral email that made the rounds about 20 years ago, but it's still funny. It's called the Post-Deity Purchase Questionnaire. God would like to thank you for your belief and patronage. In order to better serve your needs, he asks you to take a few moments to answer the following questions. How did you find out about your deity? Newspaper, Bible, Torah, Quran, television, Book of Mormon, Dead Sea Scrolls, my mama done told me, near-death experience, near-life experience, National Public Radio, burning shrubbery, other. Which model deity did you acquire? Jehovah, which is another word for Yahweh, Jesus, Krishna, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Trinity Pack, Zeus and Entourage, the Olympus Pack, Odin and Entourage, the Valhalla Pack, Allah, Satan, Gaia, God 1.0, Hairy Thunderer, God 1.0b, Cosmic Muffin, or none of the above taken in by a false god. Number 3, did your God come to you undamaged, with all parts in good working and no obvious breakage and missing attributes? If no, describe the problems you encountered here. Not eternal, finite in space, not omniscient, not omnipotent, not infinitely plastic, permits sex outside of marriage, prohibits sex outside of marriage, makes mistakes, lets bad things happen to good people, lets good things happen to good people, looks after life other than that on earth, when beseeched, doesn't stay beseeched, and requires burnt offerings or virgin sacrifices. What factors were relevant in your decision to acquire a deity? Indoctrinated by parents, needed a reason to live, indoctrinated by society, needed a focus in whom to despise or to love. Imaginary friend grew up, ate to think for myself, wanted to meet boys or girls in church, wanted to piss off parents, wanted to please parents, needed a day away from school or work, liked organ music, thought Jerry Falwell was cool, but there had to be something other than Jerry Falwell. Shit was falling out of the sky. My shrubbery caught fire and told me to do it. Now you understand that this was a viral email that I got a long time ago. I don't know the original source. But, I mean, you can imagine that there are contexts in the Jewish and the general world in which reading this out loud would be not a wise proposition. Have you ever worshipped a deity before? If so, which false god were you fooled by? Check all that apply. Baal, the almighty dollar, left-wing liberalism, the radical right, Beelzebub, Bill Gates, Barney the Purple Dinosaur, the Great Pumpkin, the Sun, the Moon, Cindy Crawford, a burning shrub, psychiatry, or something else. Are you currently using any other source of inspiration in addition to God? Which I call it applied. Tarot, lottery, astrology, television, and Landers, Psychic Friends Network, palmistry, Playboy and or Playgirl, sex, drugs, rock and roll, marijuana, Bill Clinton, Amway, CompuServe, Jimmy Swaggart, crystals, human sacrifice, wandering around the desert, burning shrubbery, Barney Fife, etc. God reputedly employs a limited degree of divine intervention to preserve a balanced level of felt presence and blind faith. Which would you prefer? More divine intervention, less divine intervention, current level is just right, and what's divine intervention? God also reputedly attempts to maintain a balanced level of disasters and miracles. Explain your rating of his handling of the following: flood, famine, earthquakes, war and Holocaust, pestilence, spam, AOL, etc. Disasters front. Miracles: rescue, spontaneous remissions, stars seen over unknown towns, crying statues, water changing to wine, getting any sex whatsoever. 9. From time to time, God reputedly makes available the names and addresses of his followers to divine personages who provide quality services and perform intercessions. Are you interested in this? Yes, deluge me with religious zealots, or I do not wish to be inundated by religious fanatics. Any other comments or suggestions? Attach an additional sheet if necessary. Now, why do we find this amusing? We find it amusing because we're far beyond the traditional concept of a God, which this is sort of making fun of. It's saying, many of these beliefs, I mean, you could imagine someone, in theory, checking off boxes seriously, who really believes a lot of these things. You may know people, even certainly in Asheville, or in your history living around the world. But we are on another place. We are somewhere else. And I say we because even if we have subtle differences between defining oneself as agnostic or atheist or humanist or a deist who believes in a God before the Big Bang, or believing in some kind of universal spirit out there that isn't a personality that writes a book but may have some way to be contacted. We're coming from very different perspectives, but we share some common values. So I want to show you a couple examples of these approaches to how to articulate what our common values are, and then, again, you may find one or another speaks to you more directly. So here's one example. This is something adopted by the National Society for Humanistic Judaism in 1999. It's their core principles. Is that, okay, that's good. So I'm just going to read through this, and again, just like Maimonides' list, you might not agree with everything, but that's okay. As members, we affirm our identity as members of the Jewish people. We draw strength from the history, culture, and achievements of our people. We see Jewish history as testimony to the continuing struggle for human dignity, and like the history of other peoples, as a product of human decisions and actions. So it's affirming that we are Jewish and we identify with our people, but also that Jewish history was not produced by miracles or divine intervention or a chosen people with special attention or special punishment. It is the product of human decisions and actions. And we see the lesson of Jewish history not as one calling us to more piety and traditional practice, but affirming human dignity and taking charge of our own lives. Second, we demonstrate our bond to the Jewish people through humanistic celebrations of Jewish holidays and life cycle events. We create and use non-theistic Jewish rituals, services, and celebrations that invoke the ethical core of Jewish history, literature, and culture. Our aim is to foster a positive Jewish identity, intellectual integrity, and ethical behavior among celebrants. This is our philosophy of why we create these celebrations. And you'll notice, other than the phrase non-theistic, there isn't any direct reference to God, tradition, prayer, that vocabulary. Because again, we're trying to affirm that we are believers. These are our positive statements of who we are. We affirm the value of study and discussion of Jewish and universal human issues. We rely on such sources as reason, observation, experimentation, creativity, and artistic expression to address questions about the world and in seeking to understand our experiences. So it isn't only science. It is science, but it's also art, creativity, personal experience. That science doesn't define everything in the world and how we understand it, and yet we do seek understanding. We do want to know something about what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be human. That's why we study beyond just the Torah, Talmud. We want a wider curriculum. We seek solutions to human conflicts that respect the freedom, dignity, and self-esteem of every human being. We make ethical decisions based on our assessment of the consequences of our actions. It's our basic theory of what you use to define what makes something good or wrong. It's not whether it offends the pieties of a religious person, or whether it violates group consensus, or if it challenges authority. The basis is, does it harm or help the freedom and dignity and self-esteem of other people? We believe it is human beings who have the responsibility for solving human problems. We are committed in the enduring Jewish tradition of support for social action and social progress to community service and actions for social justice. We each take responsibility for our own behavior, and all of us take collective responsibility for the state of our world. So we have freedom, we also have responsibility. It's that dual pole of the individual and the communal. So this is one example of an attempt to make a condensed summary of what we stand for. There are still plenty of options within that framework. It's not a list of 95 theses that you have to agree with all the way down the line, but it is an attempt to provide a general statement. Now, is this prescriptive? Well, in theory, but it's also an attempt to be descriptive of the people who join our communities share these values before they even join us. And I'll give you one other example of a statement of beliefs, and then we'll open up for some comments and questions. This is a statement that was issued in the year 2000. Let me make it a little bigger for you. Okay. When we had an international conference from an organization called the International Federation of Secular and Humanistic Jews. It's not active anymore, but we still have the statements that were issued. This is describing choosing to live as a secular humanistic Jew. It describes the setting of a pluralistic world that is increasingly secular. Judaism now is really the culture of the Jewish people because it is a national ethnic identity, not just a religious one. We experienced anti-Semitism in the Holocaust, but we also experienced the beauty of living in a democratic and free world. And so now we choose to identify as Jewish, and we can choose a meaningful version of a Jewish identity. So here are some of the commitments. Dignity. We strive to become the masters of our own lives and achieve our own dignity. Reason. We pursue the truth about ourselves through the light of reason, living with uncertainty, saying, I don't know if we don't know. Justice. We have the ultimate responsibility to work for justice in the world and strive to guarantee freedom and equality for all people. If there is to be justice, we have to make it. It's not coming from above. Study. We study the history, literature, and experience of the Jewish people and find inspiration for our own struggle to achieve personal dignity and social justice. Celebration. We celebrate the major events of Jewish history, moments of personal development, the life cycle, and seasons of nature through the holidays of the Jewish tradition. Jewish culture. We fill our lives with the flavor and substance of Jewish culture. Spirituality. We connect with experiences of beauty and self-transcendence, which give meaning to our lives and become the foundation of a naturalistic spirituality. Pluralism. We work together with other Jews to guarantee the equality of all Jews, religious or non-religious, and demonstrate by our action that diversity in Jewish life is a strength, not a weakness. Openness. We open ourselves to wisdom and beauty from other cultures and have universal standards of tolerance, pluralism, democracy, gender equality, and the pursuit of peace. And creativity. We use the creativity of the Jewish past when it addresses our needs and convictions, understanding the creativity of the Jewish present may speak with equal or greater authority. This is one of the issues that we talk about when we do a seminar on the basic ideas of secular humanistic Judaism, which would be like this session blown up to a full weekend. Which has more authority, the past or the present? In a traditional setting, the past has more authority. There's even a concept in rabbinic thought called Yeridat HaDorot, the decline of the generations. That the previous ancestors knew more, were more pious, were more authoritative, and we're just commenting on what they were able to decree. Now you could go the other extreme and say the only authority is in the present, and we don't care about the past. We're going to start from scratch. And so the French Revolution created a 10-month calendar with 10 days in a week and 10 hours in a day, and they wanted to go from scratch and forget the past. The problem was 10 days in a week means 9 days of work and 1 day off. That didn't fly very well. But some people would try to reject the past and start from scratch. And we find a balancing act between the past and the present. But we're willing to say that at times the present can supersede the past. Our values today can say that we want to read some passages of Leviticus, and we reject other passages of Leviticus. They are not more important than our sense of values and our life in the present. So as a last thought, what do we do with this historic Jewish culture and belief? Because a lot of it reflects values and beliefs that we don't share. Some of it does, and some of it doesn't. There's a marvelous story about this by the Yiddish writer Yud Lamed Peretz. It's a story called Three Gifts. I believe this story is also in that collection, Judaism in a Secular Age. A man dies and goes up to heaven. And in heaven, his deeds are weighed on a scale, his good deeds and his bad deeds. And it's found that for the first time, the scale is exactly even. So, what are they to do? Well, it turns out the only solution is to send his soul back to earth and to have him find something to help tip the scale. And so he goes down, and in the first experience he has, he sees a man traveling at night who is attacked by bandits who take him at Knifepoint. And they take all of his property from him, which he willingly surrenders, and around his neck is a small bag. And they demand the bag as well. He refuses to give them the bag. And so they stab him and he dies. They take the bag. When they open the bag, all they find in the bag is some dirt, some earth. It turns out it was earth from the land of Israel, with which he had planned to be buried. And so he would rather be a martyr than surrender this earth. And so the spirit takes the bag with the earth from Israel. The second scene sees a pogrom attacking a Jewish village. And a young Jewish woman has been taken by the mob, and they tell her, "We're going to drag you to your death behind this horse." And she says, "Give me a moment." And she takes the pins out of her hair, and she pins her dress closed, even digging the pins into her flesh so that her modesty will not be exposed. And then she is dragged to her death. And the spirit takes one of those bloody pins as his second gift. And the third scene sees a man, again during a period of Jewish oppression, who is asked to run a gauntlet between two lines of men with clubs. And he makes his way through and he survived. But along the way, one of the blows knocked off his kippah, his yarmulke. And so he faces a choice. Do I go back through the gauntlet again to cover my head, or do I go on? And the man goes back in the gauntlet to recover the yarmulke and dies. And so it's the bloody kippah. That's the third gift. The spirit goes back up to heaven, and he offers these three gifts to the judging tribunal. The judges look at the gifts, the bag and the pin and the kippah, and they say, these three gifts are absolutely beautiful, totally worthless, but absolutely beautiful. It's that last line that's the dig. Totally worthless, but absolutely beautiful. What do we do as heirs to a tradition of martyrdom for what we think may be fiction? There's something beautiful about it, about being willing to die for one's beliefs, for solidarity with one's people, but there's also something that feels like it was wrong. But maybe there's a way to appreciate the beauty of something that isn't factually true, or living by conviction even if we disagree with those convictions. That's why I find that story a marvelous meditation on an inheritance from a religious past to a secular person. I'll also mention that I heard at one point that in many Orthodox schools they read that same story, but they cut out the last line. So for them, the end of the story is, these three gifts are absolutely beautiful. The end. They cut out the absolute worthless. Well, here's another example of trying to use that inheritance to find meaning even in a secular vein. It's a marvelous poem by Yehuda Amichai. It's called Poem Without End. Okay. Inside the brand new museum, there's an old synagogue. Inside the synagogue is me. Inside me is my heart. Inside my heart, a museum. Inside the museum, a synagogue. Inside it, me. Inside me, my heart. Inside my heart, a museum. You see how that just goes on in a cycle? And it's a combination of the brand new museum dedicated to memory and the old synagogue dedicated to religion and the individual self who stands inside the synagogue but whose heart is attached to all of it and has inherited the synagogue and the new museum and himself. It's a marvelous, again, depiction of this cycle of present and past, of inheritance and individual desire and feeling. That's our ideal for how we relate to the past. It's not a question of fighting authority and we're only present, or accepting authority and we're only past. We're all at once, and all of it filtered through ourselves. The idea is that we can use the Jewish past as it feels appropriate to us, as everybody does. Notice, we might celebrate Rabbi Alicia ben Avaya, and the Orthodox might reject Alicia ben Avaya. We might celebrate Yehuda Amichai, and the Orthodox might never read Yehuda Amichai. They're making choices too. So we are part of a Jewish tradition of choosing what of our past speaks most meaningfully to us. We might prefer the Book of Ecclesiastes, which asks hard questions about justice in the universe. And is it worth it? Why are we doing this? Maybe the best thing to do is to be happy in our vineyard and enjoy a good glass of wine, and that's it. That's in the Bible too. We might find that more interesting than the Psalms that are praising God for all the wonderful things that God does and God will do. And that might be what the traditional choose from out of that library. We have this Jewish library. It has a lot of books from many centuries. And we're going to make different choices on our library card. Each of us is going to find different pieces that speak to us or are relevant, or that we would choose to celebrate when we're articulating our sense of Jewishness. So that's what this is getting at. That we can use the creativity of the past if it fits with our values, but understanding that sometimes the present may be more meaningful. We might find the Leah Goldberg poem about memory and loss is more emotionally uplifting than the traditional Kaddish. And others may find a different solution, but we're allowed to make that choice. In fact, we're empowered. One of the things I find most exciting about a humanistic Judaism is that you empower people to make their Judaism their own. It's not my Judaism I'm telling you how to do. And I know people want answers, they want to be told what to do. I appreciate the sentiment. And it would be very tempting for me to simply slip into that role. But it wouldn't be consistent with our values, and I don't think it would be the best for you either. Many people out there have already done this on some level. They make their own Haggadahs, right? A lot of people have family-made Haggadahs that are cut and pasted and put together, or maybe they have a main Haggadah, then they have inserts of readings and different passages. One family in my congregation every year used a traditional Haggadah format, Maxwell House or whatever, but they also would read the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln in 1863 every year as an example of how the value of freeing slaves continued into the modern period and in America. And in fact, the patriarch of the family was a judge, and so that was part of his affirmation of his Americanness and not just his Jewishness. That's an example of making your Judaism your own. So when I get wedding couples that come to me and want to celebrate, or funeral families talking to me about what their options are, my job is to give them options. I can help guide them in the choices. But in the end, it's going to be their Judaism, their expression of how they connect, and not what I tell them to do. That's why whenever I create services or celebrations for home practice, I almost always include more than one example of a blessing, a reading, a way to approach it. If you look at our home Hanukkah service, for example, we have different themes for the different nights. So on the first night, you can talk about the theme of generosity. On the second night, you talk about the theme of hope, and so on. But I have 3 or 4 different versions of those in the book. Because maybe one speaks to a younger audience, one speaks to an older audience, or one wants more history, and one wants more intellectual inspiration. There's no one way to do it. I even have a Yiddish version for those who don't want the Hebrew. So this is why I think we need to think of living Judaism in this vein of creativity, in this vein of ownership, of inheritance, that it becomes yours, rather than only thinking about it as tradition that we have to keep the same going through.